Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 9 on Other Policy Instrument Options. You'll recall that last week we talked about regulation and different forms of regulation because obviously regulation is a very important policy instrument used for protection of the environment. But, in the regulatory process within government, it's contingent upon regulators to determine whether there are other policy instruments that maybe are less intrusive to resolve a problem, an environmental problem or an environmental harm. So in this case, we need to be also aware of other policy instrument options, and that's what we're discussing today in Lesson 9. All right, so let's get started. Other policy instrument options that can be used to address priorities under the authorities of legislative acts there's a number of them that can be used. As I said, regulators that must consider these environmental policy and regulators must consider these options under our regulatory rules. Okay, regulations are the most heavily used, yes, but there are other policy instruments. Okay, and that's what we'll talk about today. And there are five that I want to refer to today. One is economic instruments. The other is self-regulation, voluntary approaches, information and exhortation, and public investment. Okay, let's consider each of these. And they are used extensively in environmental policy as well. Perhaps not as much as regulation, but they are used extensively. We know that, for example, with the carbon tax, right? That's clearly an economic instrument. So let's look at economic instruments. So economic instruments create an economic incentive to influence the factors that are contributing to a harm, all right, an environmental harm. That incentive can be a cost, such as taxes, charges, or fines, or on the other side, a financial subsidy, such as an accelerated tax depreciation of new technology, and other forms of subsidies. All right, so economic instruments to impose costs typically attempt to address market failures. In other words, a charge on an industrial byproduct or a pollution that flows out into a river or into the air. An economic instrument can impose a cost which encourages the regulated party or the party that is emitting those wastes into the environment to reduce those wastes, because then they will reduce their cost under the economic instrument. And that's the basis for a carbon tax, obviously, such that if we charge a carbon tax, people will likely have a tendency to not waste that resource, to not burn as much fossil fuels, and therefore emit less into the environment. That's the concept of reducing greenhouse gases through a carbon tax. Okay, so externalities, right, are market failures. When costs associated with the production or use of a product or service are externalized from the market price, this is something that an economic instrument tries to address from an environmental policy perspective, right? Because these prices, when they don't reflect the full cost of production, they send price signals to the market, right? Those price signals are that the product is a lot cheaper than it actually is to produce when you take the environmental cost into account. All right, so economic instruments try to correct for that. They try to charge so that the company has an incentive to reduce that waste, or to reduce that pollution, to reduce that charge, and thereby they are internalizing the cost of those externalities into their product price. All right, and that's the way that economic instruments tend to be used. And examples of economic instruments that impose costs are carbon taxes, tradable permits, charges on wastewater and hazardous waste disposal, elevated charges on electricity during peak hours. All of these things are economic instruments. All right. I remember when I used to be involved, I get involved in construction projects from time to time, and I remember 25, 30 years ago when we were doing construction projects, construction waste, we would throw it on the back of our half-ton trucks and drive it to the solid waste site and just dump it in the legitimate solid waste site, but we would just dump it no charge or a very menial charge, very minor charge, right? Whereas today, if you do that and you take it to the dump, it's going to cost you about $600 a load. There's a classic example of using an economic incentive to create a disincentive for unnecessary waste in construction sites, right? That's just one applied example. So by raising costs of production to better reflect actual costs, right? Economic instruments raise the price of a product or service in the marketplace because the costs that were previously externalized, like dumping that waste for nothing, gets internalized into the project by better resource planning, computerized models to make sure you buy just enough 2x4s, laser cutting tools. All these things are, become more expensive for the company, but they are internalized into the price, and then they're passed on to the consumer in terms of the price, right? So then the consumer also uses those resources more efficiently because the price is higher, and the circle improves all the way through the supply chain. All right, that's the concept. Businesses and or individuals are presented with an incentive to internalize externalities and lower costs, and this is the whole point behind economic instruments. All right. Now, self-regulation is another another policy instrument that governments can use. And you might say, well, if it's self-regulation, how is the government involved? Well, typically, the government will set out a legislative framework that will enable a certain organization or a certain body to self-regulate itself. We do that with our doctors, lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and so on. Does that mean the government's not involved? No, the government sets out the parameters in legislation as to how these organizations are going to be allowed to self-regulate. All right? So typically that will eliminate the need for the government to internalize all of those capacities to regulate those expert groups, right? And so that's a big advantage for the government. But the other advantage for the government is that these self-regulated organizations have an incentive to maintain high levels of self-regulation because of their professional brand, right? So doctors, lawyers, accountants, real estate agents have a great deal of incentive to ensure that, right, their members are in high compliance, because there's a couple of risks: that the whole profession can come into disrepute, or that the government can reclaim the regulatory function. And that happened, for example, with real estate agents in British Columbia when a lot of money laundering was found and so on. The British Columbia government basically revoked self-regulation and now is regulating real estate agents within the government itself. So self-regulated bodies are a very efficient way for the government to proceed, yet maintaining high levels of protection from harms for the public. All right, and high levels of voluntary compliance, because licenses to practice law or to be a doctor or to be a real estate agent can be revoked by these bodies and so on. So they have quite heavy sticks, and they have quite dynamic compliance promotion activities to support their profession as well. And so governments set up this framework through legislation. They stipulate regulatory objectives, and the rights and obligations of self-regulating constituencies are clearly defined within law. But then those bodies are allowed to self-regulate, okay? Voluntary approaches. Well, how is government involved in voluntary approaches? Well, the government can often encourage voluntary approaches in one way. So they will work with the industry to encourage them to adopt a voluntary approach. Or alternatively, the industry may sell a voluntary approach to government in an effort to keep the government out of their business, so the government does not feel inclined to regulate more comprehensively. There are many examples of voluntary approaches like that. And voluntary approaches can be very effective for some baseline requirements to reduce harms. A classic example of voluntary approach in chemistry is the Responsible Care Program. But we have the Canadian Industry Partnership for Energy Conservation, Forest Stewardship Council, Global Reporting Initiative, ISO, CSA standards, Global Compact, etc., 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 where the government creates the environment for these voluntary approaches to be legitimized and to carry on and provide an important function for the government, because like self-regulation, then the government does not need to get heavily involved in these activities. Yet these parties have a high degree of incentive to maintain high levels of harm reduction and high levels of compliance. All right, so voluntary approaches can be very effective, but the reality is that voluntary approaches are very effective to the extent that the government is always watching, and the government, if necessary, can always step in. And of course, the proponents of the voluntary approach don't want to have that happen. All right. And so, involuntary approaches are not only reinforced by the potential threat of the stick from government, but also, voluntary approaches are often encouraged by consumer backlash, and because consumers will also have a say in whether they feel that the voluntary approach is legitimate or not. All right, consumers can vote with their money, for example, when you're dealing with forest products or you're dealing with other kinds of products. Consumers will have a significant impact on voluntary approaches as well. Okay. Information and exhortation. There's another sort of major thrust of activities. Like governments can usually combine information and exhortation with other policy instruments, or as a lead-up to policy instruments that will be used. For example, when Canada legalized cannabis, there was a lot of information and exhortation activities going on up to 2 years before cannabis was actually regulated, or basically legalized and regulated, right? And so information and exhortation can often be used to support other regulations as well, like cell phone use in cars, and not drinking and driving, and throwing your waste and recycling. Information and exhortation is used in a number of areas as a relatively less intrusive way to get the public to change its behavior, but change its behavior through better information, better sort of convincing them to act in a proper manner. All right, and that's always better if a harm reduction objective is such that the harm is not so severe. It's not an acute harm. It's not a really rapidly accumulating harm that's going to cause serious problems. But nevertheless, it is something we should clean up, and it is a harm. It is unsightly, or it is potentially dangerous. The government might elect instead to undertake a information and exhortation campaign at any level of government, and we see these all the time. When Elections Canada will do that, right? Running up to elections, these types of things. When it's easier to accomplish your objective by informing, educating, and cajoling the public to come into compliance. Okay. Finally, there's public investment. Public investment is a big one. It's one we don't often see and understand, but it involves the state socializing the costs of addressing an important factor contributing to reducing a public harm. For example, in order to provide fresh potable water to our citizens, the state invests in that public infrastructure. There's other cases. For example, in developing countries, when a country wants to set up an industrial park of high polluting industries, none of the individual companies that move in there would be able to afford to build their own wastewater plants. So the government, in order to achieve an environmental harm reduction, will set the companies up in an area, and then the government will invest in the wastewater plant through public investment to prevent a harm. All right. When we first started to have hazardous waste disposal facilities in Canada, it was the government initially that would invest in these hazardous waste facilities, right? Prior to the realization that with good regulation and good monitoring, the hazardous waste stream could be more predictable. Then and only then would private entities invest in these expensive facilities to build, because they had trust in the regulatory structure such that they knew how much volume they were going to get yet they could run the numbers and they could say, yes, we could build this and we could make a profit. But prior to that, it took public investment to enter into that space. There was a missing market. It took public investment to move in there and prevent the harm of these wastes being disposed haphazardly, being put in the riverbed or dug a hole and dumped in a hole or burned or whatever. The government set up regulations and built the plants, it built the disposal sites, the engineered hazardous waste sites themselves, all right? So that then the public had a place to put its waste according to harm reduction rules, all right? And only afterwards, when it was seen that, yeah, there is a constant stream, yes, they are enforcing the regulation, then private sector guys go, we can build that one because we know we can make a profit now, okay? So these are the types of public investment things that can be used to protect from harm. And that's a very prominent policy instrument, right? We see it all the time when in some jurisdictions that can't afford, water purification plants, they can't afford to build their own solid waste plant, solid waste disposal site, or they can't afford to, manage their own waste disposal, wastewater disposal. There are a number of different areas of the environment where the public investment may be required, right? And we see that obviously in many, many other areas, right? Roads, education, waste disposal. There are a number of areas of public investment. But from our perspective, it also is an important policy instrument in the area of the environment. Granted, in the area of the environment, whenever the volume or the security of an issue becomes more stabilized and more demonstrated, private sector and investment can tend to move in. For example, now we have a very large private sector recycling industry in Canada. Most of our solid waste sites now are privately owned. Many of our hazardous waste disposal sites now, our incineration sites, are privately owned. So over time, when there's confidence built up that the people are going to follow the rules, there is a predictable volume of a waste or whatever we're looking at, the private sector can justify investing in that sector, and the government's public investment will withdraw. Okay, so public investment can be very important, but it tends to be filling a gap where the private sector is not there, where that infrastructure is needed to prevent a harm. All right, and that's very important a policy instrument area as well. Okay, so this is a quick lesson on these various policy instruments. The big ones from our point of view are how regulation can relate to economic instruments, how regulation can relate to exhortation and information, and how regulation can relate to public investment. And because in a lot of areas of the environment, you won't just see one of these policy instruments at work solving a major issue, but you will see a combination of them. And you'll learn more about that in the second term. All right? On that score, I'll let you go, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.